All right. Hello, everyone. How are you? Good. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Goins. I'm the Director of Adult Education for Faculty and Instruction here at Triton. I started teaching ESL in the city colleges several years back, and I transitioned here as the Assistant ESL Director, and now I'm working as the Director of all adult education. Since we're such a small, intimate group, do you guys want to introduce yourselves, say what you teach?
My name is Mary Elkins, and I teach allied health related classes.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well.
I'm Carol Luke, and I teach graphic design in the visual communications department.
Oh, cool. My name is Jim, and I teach psychology, different flavors.
Well, I want to start by saying we only have an hour, so the bulk of this presentation is going to be spent kind of raising your awareness of the different kind of English language learners that are out there. The different English language learner student audiences. And then at the end, we'll briefly touch on some things that you can do to modify your instruction to accommodate these different types of learners. But within just an hour's time, we can't really dive really deep into instructional interventions for each student audience. But I have brought some recommendations for literature that you can read or books that you can read if you really want to kind of dive in more. So with that, I want to start with two questions. We're a Hispanic serving institution. A lot of our students speak English as a second language, so I know that they're in your classes.
Yes.
So what are some of the difficulties that you've seen or witnessed that they face? And have you noticed that they differ in terms of their abilities? What do you guys think, Mary?
Well, the biggest thing is understanding of more technical English terms. I have one student who she's from a Hispanic background, and she always stays after my class to ask me questions. What does this word mean? Can you explain this a little bit better to me? So I do a lot of explaining of, definition of words, just so that it's comprehensive ethics, so it can be a little tricky.
Yeah.
And another thing that I find is almost all of my, I'm going to say at least 80% of my English as a second language students work very hard.
Okay.
They work very, very hard.
How do you know they're ESL students?
Because they tell me.
Like, do you hold them?
Nope. I talk to my students a lot. A lot of my classes are very relaxed, and I kind of get to know my students, and a lot of times they'll come up between, during breaks or after classes or before classes and come in and talk to me, and I get to know them a little bit better. So I just know that they're this is their second, or English is their second language.
Those are really great examples. Anybody else want to add to this list? Things you noticed, things that the students are struggling
My
with?
problem's an overall cultural thing. I really think that I have a lot of Latinas who've been taught not to speak.
You know what, though, that's another thing I see too. It's not all of them will. It gets to the point where they're failing, and then they say, and I say, you could have always come to talk to me. Oh, I didn't want to bother you, or I didn't, and I don't know if that's their culture that they just kind of hang back.
Yeah.
But I'm not even talking about getting help, but rather while we're reading this material or having discussions or whatever, they've been taught not to participate.
Yes, I see that as well.
They're quieted to a degree of having almost like an anxiety disorder, but it's the degree to which they're learning material and how hard they're working varies entirely within that population.
Yes, it does.
People aren't saying the word all semester and they're totally getting everything. And they do great on any assessments, and then there's ones where you're just falling and everything in between, but it's always, yeah, teams.
I see a big lack of classroom participation as well. Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
It's some kind of cultural thing, I think.
Yeah.
It's,
I'm really glad you touched on this because, especially in places like Asia, classes are very traditional. Teacher is the sage on the stage. Students take notes. They absorb the information and they perform on assessments. Whereas here in America, we're trying to get our students in the group to stop, to talk, to construct meaning, all of these things. So I'm really glad you brought that up. And I think we'll see when we look at these different audiences how some of these things manifest themselves more strongly in certain audiences and not in others. So we'll talk about that. You had something on the tip of your tongue.
No, well, it's more the problems that I have with Korean
Okay.
students. And like, there were two girls that were very close friends to each other, and one kind of led the other, you know. The one that was the leader broke down in tears at one point because she wasn't getting an A. So,
Yeah.
And then, you know, really, their tests, how they write, how they understood things,
Yeah.
was
Mhm.
big gap.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I do have one student, and she's from some area of Africa, and she is, when she speaks with me, I don't take it personally, but when she speaks to me, it's very demanding. You will let me, you will meet with me so that I can make up my test, and you will do this and you will do that, and you will give me extra credit because I want an A, I won't have a B, and you will look at this. And I finally looked at her and I said, if you want an A, you need to work harder. I'm sorry. But very, very demanding in her demeanor. And I don't know, I think that might be cultural. That's the way that I take it.
Yeah, very well could be.
Right.
Small sample size.
Yeah, so there's a lot of good things on here. First of all, we could unpack these terms. This could relate to what you said, register, right? How do you say things in a way that's socially appropriate, or how do you write academically? So there are some really nuanced things that native speakers do who have been writing for a long time that our students just can't do because they don't understand the difference between formal and informal language. We got a lot of cultural differences going on. School culture, like in places like Korea, there's really high value on grades and this lack of student participation. So I want to tease all these things out and talk about how some of them align more with different audiences than others. So I want to talk about 3 prototypical adult English language learners. And I'll preface this by saying ESL students, or students who speak English as an additional language, are a very diverse group of students, and it's really impossible to make really, really strong generalizations, but there are some really helpful categories. So meet James. James is from, guess where? South Korea, and he's 21 years old, and he moved to the U.S. when he was 20, and he finished high school in South Korea. All right, so he's one type of student or kind of student that we see. This is Lucia. She's from Venezuela. She's 19. She moved to the United States when she was 8 with her family, and she graduated from an American high school. She may or may not have been in a bilingual education program in her elementary school. We don't really know. And then finally we have Miguel. Sorry, Jim, this is some review for you.
Because I forgot it was the one talking about this.
So Miguel's from Mexico. He's 27, and he moved to the U.S. when he was 25. He won the green card lottery, and he just recently passed his GED test in Spanish, and now he's going to start taking college classes in English. All right? So these are 3 different groups. James is an international student, right? And this is the definition of an international student. Somebody who studied in their home country from kindergarten to 12th grade, and who has come to the United States to pursue some advanced degree and return to their home country. Right? This is an international student. In some cases, they'll end up staying here, but they come over initially for the stated purpose of just studying and going home. Lucia is an early arriving immigrant student. I'm not making these terms up. These are terms that practitioners and researchers have kind of come up with as they've kind of studied these different types of students. Early arriving immigrant student is a student who is either born in the US or came here before the age of 10 years old, but was born to an immigrant family. And then you have Miguel, who came here when he was 25. And Miguel, we're going to call a late arriving immigrant student. So an immigrant student who came here after the age of 10 years old. So 3 very different audiences, and all of these struggle with very different things. So let's kind of unpack. But before we do, a really important distinction when you're thinking about English language learners. There's a scholar by the name of Jim Cummins, and he came up with this term, basic interpersonal communication skills, BICS, right? And according to research, if someone is in an optimal language learning environment, it takes them about this long to acquire BICS, basic interpersonal communication skills. So if they're studying English, if they're immersed in it, if they're diligent, they can become pretty conversational pretty fast. Mm-hmm. Cummins also came up with this acronym, CALP, Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency. So this gets at all of the academic language that we use and the language strategies that we use in producing academic texts. This, according to research, takes a lot longer to develop, 5 to 7 years. So there are consequences depending on, so here we go, there's an iceberg. So a student can appear to be pretty fluent or conversational in English, but, or as I'm speaking to you right now, I'm using mostly BICS, maybe I'm using some academic vocabulary and structures, but if you met me on the street, we just had a conversation, you go, wow, Mitch is pretty fluent in English. But what you don't see under the surface is all of the academic vocabulary that I don't have, all of the phrases and structures that we use to convey meaning in academic texts that I don't have, right? Transitional words, phrases to build cohesion in text, all of these things, reading strategies to extract meaning from complex texts. I don't have any of this stuff, but you don't really know because you're only my BICS, right?
That just occurred to me, I think I have just as big a problem at least with people who've been speaking English their whole life, but they just came from really bad grade schools and high schools.
Yep. Right.
So they don't have the calc either.
They don't have the calc either. Yeah, right. Yeah. So that's absolutely right. So your students that you're talking about who are asking you with these academic vocabulary words, their calc is really lacking, and it takes a lot longer to develop. So if this is our iceberg, and we have in someone's first language, let's talk about James. He's an international student who went to a really good school in South Korea, and he can read. He has a lot of academic reading and writing strategies in the Korean language, right? He has a really robust calc in his first language. Well, that's really going to help him when he's trying to develop calc in his second language, right? So when I talk about reading and writing strategies, this is what I mean. When I sit down to read a complex academic text, there are many things that I do. I underline things. I annotate the pages. I go back and connect in my mind things I read here to things I'm reading here. I look up words I don't know. These are all things that I do, that I've been trained to do to absorb this information. And in writing, it's the same way. There are many things that I do to bring a text to completion. I have a lot of strategies. Sometimes I put it away, I go for a run, I have to come back to it. Sometimes I just write gibberish until I find a train of thought. We all have these strategies. James has those too in Korean, so he can draw on those when he's in an English classroom, right? He knows how to look up vocabulary words. He knows how to use a dictionary. He knows how to annotate a text. He knows how to do all these things. So imagine somebody like Miguel, who came here when he was 25, only had a 5th grade education. He just squeaked by and passed his GED. His Calpin, his first language, is much, much smaller than James's. Mm-hmm. And as a result, he's going to have a much more difficult time developing it in his first language. So I'll shut up about this, but it's a really helpful tool to kind of understand some of students' difficulties or deficiencies.
But what we say is just a small part of what's going on.
Yeah. So James, he can do the work outside of class. He can prepare. He can do the readings, right? Miguel might not even have the strategies to know where to start,
Not even the base.
study habits or anything, right? So anyways, let's move on. Okay, so characteristics of an international student like James. What are their difficulties? So there's this distinction that's made in the second language literature between an eye learner and an ear learner. What do you guys think an eye learner is?
Show them stuff.
Say that again?
Show them stuff.
Yes, they have acquired a lot of the language that they have through their eyes, through reading, through bookwork, right? So James studied English in Korea almost his whole K through 12 experience, but he studied it in books, right? Even his teachers weren't really fluent. He knows a lot of grammar, right? He knows a lot of vocabulary. He's learned it through his eyes. And an ear learner, the opposite is true. No bookwork education, mostly all exposure to English through their ears in English-speaking environments. So he's an eye learner, right? He hasn't had much exposure at all until he moved to the U.S. to spoken English. He has a strong first language foundation. These are the reading and writing skills I was talking about, literacy skills in Korean. He has a strong Calp, right? He has vocabulary, academic vocabulary knowledge in Korean and probably in English too, because he studied so much vocabulary in English books. He has formal grammar knowledge, probably from the books that he studied in Korea. Academic literacy skills. He understands this concept of using context clues to look up words, all of this. But he has really, really weak Bics. Why? Because he just moved here. He's never really spoken English. And he has no native intuition whatsoever. So he'll say things that a native speaker would never, ever say, right? And when he says them, we just go, that doesn't sound right. I can't tell you why, but a native speaker would never say that. So that's kind of a portrait of James's language skills. And yeah, he has low undeveloped oral skills. Also low cultural knowledge, right? He's only lived here a year, right? So a lot of these things that we talked about might be really relate to James. I was reading about how a lot of Korean students or students who come from Asia, it's not appropriate in their culture to go talk to a teacher after class, right? That's just not something that they do. So often, and they're not comfortable doing it alone, so often they'll do it in pairs. They stick together and they go to the teacher together in pairs, or they'll never raise their hand in class or ask a question because they're in class with native speakers and they don't have strong BICs, basic interpersonal communication skills. So they're going to out themselves right away, right? I'm going to look stupid. I don't know how to construct this question that I have in English. And they might get easily lost because they have low cultural knowledge, right? There might be a cultural reference in the teacher's lecture or in a reading that just kind of throws them for a loop, right? So
I find that similar thing is true for at least half my students, because I think of them as academically wounded. They've got an affective filter that asking a question, making a comment, these are scary things for them.
Yeah.
They're afraid to be wrong, they're afraid
Right.
to step out there, and I think that's true of, regardless of
Yeah.
where they're coming language-wise, and
Right.
the education system again.
Yeah.
And probably their families just
Right.
not taught that, asking questions is a fun thing to do, even when they're wrong.
Right.
To be wrong.
Yeah.
So I've been trying to practice that, being wrong about stuff,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it just activates the
Yeah.
effective filter.
Yeah. You mean it lowers it or it heightens it?
It makes it worse.
Yeah.
But I reviewed a test the other day,
Mm-hmm.
and so I had somebody read each question. And then we got to my Vietnamese student, and I said, will you read this question in Vietnamese? So he just read the whole question in Vietnamese, and nobody understood, of course, what he said. It was just beautiful. It's like a song.
Yeah.
And then another guy read another question in Arabic, and they were the only ones who understood any overall reading in English. So,
Right.
but I'm like, hey, let's
Yeah.
have fun with this.
Yeah. I think
They
whatever.
understood the word you said, it was beautiful.
It's a good icebreaker.
Yeah.
It should be.
It gives them a chance to feel comfortable in
Yeah.
an uncomfortable environment.
Yeah.
Good for you.
Theory, yeah, in
Yeah.
theory, so I have to be careful with that affective filter, because
Yeah.
it could go the other way,
Mhm.
and it could feel more burnt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sensitive.
Yeah.
So it's,
Yeah.
It's a tough balancing act, isn't it?
Yeah. I think it also gives you a window into how well they can flip the language back and forth too.
yeah,
Because if I were trying to say something in another language,
Right.
it would just,
Oh,
Right.
you're trained in
it
Yeah.
did take them, right, they both said, okay, it's gonna take me a second.
but they
Yeah.
did it.
And then they did it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then somebody else read one in Spanish, but you don't have the class.
Like the class experience.
Yeah.
I'm so glad that you're thinking about the affective filter and their emotions, because I think you're right. That's applicable to every single student. And I still remember, like, being academically wounded myself. I think we all do. There's a couple times I can remember in college where a professor just came at me
Oh,
when I was giving a presentation, and I've never forgotten that, and I've had a pretty successful academic experience. Imagine the students at this school,
right.
their life has been full of those experiences.
That's a
So-
good point for me to go back and
Yeah.
feel what that was like for me.
But even more so for these students, like international students, someone who has no BICS,
Right.
and like it's even a huge risk for him to open his mouth in a group discussion, right? Because he might not be understood, or so anything you can do to make these students feel as comfortable as possible,
Yeah.
so that they can actually learn. No one can learn when they're freaking out.
Right.
Okay, so this is kind of a portrait of James. Does this kind of make sense
Yes.
of his background? And
Mhm.
we'll see that the other students are very different. So let's look at Lucia. She's from Venezuela, 19. She came here when she was 8. She graduated from American High School. Okay, clicker. All right, so we're calling her an early arriving immigrant student. So she's an ear learner, right? So she started hearing English when she was a young girl, thrown into the education system. Let's just assume for a little bit, she was maybe in bilingual education, but not that long. She was so young, she acquired the language so quickly, she was in mainstream classes. But what's different about her is she has a pretty weak, typically these students have a pretty weak foundation in their first language. Why? Because she was in school in Venezuela, then she was in school here, and she hasn't been in an environment to kind of cultivate these literacy skills in her first language like James was.
And by literacy skills, you mean grammar?
Yeah, grammar, syntax, reading strategies, all of these things, vocabulary development. It's much different than James's experience, which was like his whole experience in one language. He developed all these skills. So another thing that's very different than James is she has really strong basic interpersonal communication skills. I would say a huge number of our students at Triton are Lucias, right? They came here, they were either born here to parents who spoke a different language, or they came here really young. You talk with them, you think that's a native speaker. But what you don't realize is the weak first language foundation as a result of this transition earlier in their life. She has strong general vocabulary knowledge. She has native intuition. So because she came here so early, her ear knows what's awkward, right? Just like our ear knows when something isn't right. Even if we don't know the grammar rules, she doesn't know the grammar rules, she'll say that doesn't sound right. James, he couldn't do that.
Yep.
Well-developed oral skills, sounds like a native speaker, pretty well-developed cultural knowledge from living here for 15 years or more. This kind of differs, but presumably and generally speaking, Lucias have pretty weak cognitive academic language proficiency because of their late start in the language and the disruption of the education in their first language, right? So their CALP isn't as well developed. And so she cannot draw on her first language literacy skills as much as James can because they're not as well developed. And she usually has underdeveloped academic vocabulary in both of her languages. So there's this way to think about vocabulary. There's general vocabulary, which is probably all the vocabulary that you use in BICS, basic interpersonal communication skills. Then there's academic, which is still kind of general but a higher level. And then there's specific. So this is tier 1, this is called tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And James has this, and maybe some of this. This is like specific to a discipline, like terms that are used in the field of psychology or graphic design or philosophy. James might even have all three of these. Lucia is really strong here, but she doesn't so much. She might have a little bit of this from high school, but she doesn't have nearly as much vocabulary knowledge as James would. And so this is
another overlay for that. For me, like one of my dear friends of 30 years came here from Italy when he was 8. And to this day, there's little holes in his way of expressing things.
Yeah.
Explaining things, and
right.
Part of it is because I think he has lived in an encased environment surrounded by Italians. And his mom and one of his close relatives don't speak anything but Italian.
Right.
And his other relatives prefer to speak. He invited me over for Thanksgiving. I couldn't believe it, how much Italian there was around. I was like, hello.
Right.
I don't speak anything.
Right.
I speak 6 words. Of
Yeah, that's.
So there's that whole, have they really come to the United States? How much are
Right.
they getting immersed in it?
Yeah.
If they keep going back to their environment, and it's that language that.
This is such a good point because I think about my growing up years and just being exposed to conversations my parents were having with their friends. I absorbed these phrases of a general nature, academic nature that sometimes they just come to me when I'm writing or something, and they're just there.
Right.
Those are not there for Lucia, right? Because she wasn't in those environments. She wasn't being read to in one language from when she was an infant. So, like, here's a little funny example. I don't know why it's in my mind, but sometimes in English we say, insofar as that is possible, right? This phrase, insofar as, that's something that I use a lot. Lucia would never use that. Right? Like I picked that up from my dad when I was a really young kid.
Sure.
You know? So these are the little holes that we're talking about that really are disguised until a student starts to write or reflex test and then they start to reveal themselves, these holes. Okay, so this is a portrait of Lucia. You can see some of the really salient differences. Ear learner versus salient. Academic, right?
I just lost Lucia.
I just lost Lucia.
And to what would you attribute that?
Right. See? To what would you attribute this? This is academic phrase that Lucia wouldn't have,
right?
right?
A student come up and say, what is this word? This unanimity.
Oh, okay.
and they didn't know what that
Yeah.
was. So I think it just reminds me like, oh, okay, there's things out there
Yeah.
that are like landmines to them.
Right.
Taken for granted by me.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of use this language. This is kind of got to get a little political here, but like you go into an interview and you want to show that you're an educated person, that you're articulate, that you're knowledgeable. So you use all this language, right? And it gives you power in the social hierarchy. Whereas like Lucia, she's a little bit handicapped from the start because she hasn't acquired some of this academic,
Mm-hmm.
James is even more handicapped. So let's look at Miguel. I think Miguel is probably the student who struggles the most. There are a lot of Miguels in our adult ed program. It's probably all Miguels. Usually ear learners. Remember, a late arriving immigrant student is someone who came here after 10, but a lot of them have come here in adolescent or adult life. And so they're getting a way later start with their language acquisition. They're usually ear learners or a mix because they come to an ESL program. So there's some eye learning. Their first language academic foundation really varies. So you might have some students who have like PhDs in other countries coming here to the US. That they would have a really strong calc. But I would say the majority of the students in my program have weak calc and they haven't even finished the K through 12 education in their home country.
Mm-hmm.
Usually just have general vocabulary knowledge, nothing more. Language intuition really varies based on how old they are when they come. If they come, like Miguel has probably very little language intuition. Why? Because he just moved here. If someone came here when they're 12, it would be very different. He has developing oral skills, might be a little bit stronger than James, but much weaker than Lucia in his developing cultural knowledge, and will speak accented English.
The accent, yeah. It makes it so obvious.
Yeah.
If someone comes here when they're 40 or whatever.
Yeah.
They might have all kinds of stuff going on, but man, that accent is so thick.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And James's English will be probably really accented as well. Lucia's probably won't. Hers will probably be pretty native.
Because she's been here since she's 8, so she's talking a lot.
Right. Yeah.
About the locals. Yeah.
Right.
Local locals.
So the takeaway here, I guess, is it's kind of good to know where your students are on the spectrum, right?
It is.
So you can kind of understand better ways to help them. And we'll talk about some ways to help these three groups specifically. But if you have a Lucia in your class, you might have Lucias in your class that you don't even realize are second language learners,
Yeah.
right? And the way that you help them is very different than you help James. Here's a really small example of how Lucia's holes manifest themselves. They manifest themselves in little ways, but here's one that I see a lot come from Lucia's, and this is a mistake that James would never make. So they might write this in a paper. Instead of writing I would have, remember they're ear learners, right? So they're right. I would have, that's how we say it, right? If we say, I would have done it had you told me, but we would write it like this, or as a contraction like this. But Lucia will probably write it like this, which is a little thing, right? But it's just a small example of how she's not going to be as strong as a native speaker in these areas. And native speakers will do this too, right? I would do this as a kid too, as a native speaker. But then it started to be corrected in me in junior high. And so you'll see and one of the biggest manifestations of the holes of a Lucia will be their writing will be much more conversational, less academic, and they have less of a hold on the academic register
than a native speaker would, right? So you can help them by explaining, differences between formal and informal language, giving them frames, giving them phrases that they can use, giving them forms that they can kind of use to write more academically or use more academic vocabulary, that kind of a thing. So that's just a small example of, and James, because he's an I learner, he would never write that. He would always write would have, because that's what he's always seen. He's seen that repeatedly, and he probably knows grammar rules, right? He knows this. He could give this a name, right? He's learned very formal prescriptive grammar in Korea, So, all right. So, like I said before, it's really hard to kind of unpack all the ways you can help different students because they do kind of bleed together as well. So I have some books I want to recommend if this is whetting your appetite for more, but we'll scratch the surface. So, supporting James. His profile is over here on the side, all the things we talked about. So, here's the first thing. Just be aware of the fact that there are people in your class that are going to have a difficult time following you, if they're like James, right? So one thing you could do is kind of modify your speaking, and maybe if you're going to be doing a lecture of some kind or watching a video, providing a transcript or something in another modality that they can use to kind of follow along. Lucia's not going to have any trouble, but James will, Miguel will, so just being conscious of your speaking, and just notice when you or a tech uses slang or idiomatic expressions, and be ready to kind of clarify the meaning of things in class. James has very little cultural knowledge, so he could easily get lost. So could Miguel. For topics that require a lot of cultural background, provide pre-reading to build background knowledge. What else? Provide sentence and paragraph frames in your academic field that students can refer to for writing and discussions. So I think the important thing here for James is if you're going to ask him to participate in class verbally, you have to support him, right, in some way. And that might be just by giving him simple, conversation starters, or I think this is valuable because, or I disagree with this for this reason, or things like that that would kind of scaffold his participation in the class. I don't know, are some of these things resonating? What do you guys think?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It looks different in my classroom because how comfortably aware are your students? I would say that I had a class of 30 and I said, how many of you have seen It's a Wonderful Life? 3 out of 30 have seen that movie. I would wager that almost not a single one of my students knows who Robert Mueller is.
Oh, wow.
And that it's just we'll go on from there. They're very much not aware culturally.
Yeah.
And I'm considering maybe having an exam after I spend a couple classes developing a learning community so we, as best as possible, trust each other.
Yeah.
I'd like to have an exam where I give people questions and it turns out they all miss all of them. And then I can go see everybody in here is a second language learner. Because this is all new stuff to you. Everybody in here is learning this new.
Are you talking about psychology content?
Everything.
Everything.
I can go way beyond psychology content and they won't know what it is.
Right.
So I think preparation for college and preparation for the level at which I wish we were learning things, they're kind of all in the same boat.
Yeah.
I'm not sure this is any worse being second language learner, but it is just being poorly prepared for college, you know what
Yeah.
I'm saying?
Yeah.
Which is great, it's great for me to come to that realization, because the more you talk about one thing, that every single person in my class is coming from a different place.
Yeah.
So it's great having the categories, but on the other
Yeah.
hand, each one of these people has their
Yeah.
own set of challenges.
Right.
And as a rule, they're all very much challenged. The one that does a flag for me is cultural knowledge.
Right.
They don't
Yeah.
have that, they're not generally educated about what's
Right.
happening.
Yeah.
Well, which is exciting, because it means
Right.
I can turn around to it.
Right.
However, it means I'm gonna have to remember that.
Yeah.
You know, going into it, it's like every semester I'm shocked again
Right.
at how much they don't know, which is cool. It means they need us.
Right.
Yeah, I showed a photograph of Eleanor Roosevelt to my
Mhm.
class, and I mean, there's Native American kids. Nobody
No clue.
could identify Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yeah.
So sometimes you have to watch
Yeah.
what cultural reference
Yeah.
it is.
Mhm. Yeah.
It has to be super common stuff for everybody to get it.
Yeah.
Right.
I think though there might be some things that they all know regardless of their various. I'm just thinking, like I teach a class at DePaul, and sometimes I'll play this Jeopardy game, and when I do pop culture, DePaul's a little more homogeneous than
Yeah.
here.
Right.
Their students are, but it's all stuff they know, like pop culture stuff, right? So, but I think your point is valid. Like, there are some people who have rich cultural knowledge in this community and from this community that they're from, but none of it really, there's not a ton of overlap maybe. So, it's interesting.
Yeah, what do we mean by like
Yeah.
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 I want to get your Jeopardy game if people are, if everybody's knowing about it, because I'm always looking for stuff that I can start with as a base where they're all on
Yeah.
the same page.
Yeah,
It's hard.
it is.
find them.
Yeah, it is hard.
It'll
Especially,
probably be funny as you won't know the answers.
yeah,
Yeah, sometimes I know more about pop culture than them, and then I'm like, you guys, the
yeah,
63-year-old thankfully like that.
Yeah.
You should know more than me about pop culture.
Right.
Go.
yeah.
I oughta immortalize them.
So, the sentence frames, so I have a comment here about CALP. BICS is developed through extensive listening and social interaction, but CALP is not. CALP is mostly developed through extensive exposure to academic texts, through reading, synthesizing them, and through explicit instruction. And so the takeaway here is, if you have a student who's having trouble writing academically in a way that is clear, with the appropriate register, and the text is cohesive and understandable, then I think the best thing to do is to provide some really clear models for them. Get a good student paper or write a paper yourself, give it to every student, and just walk through that sucker and be like, okay, what is the author doing in the beginning with this first paragraph? What are the phrases that they use? They're giving us a sense of where they're going, right? We have some idea of what's going to be next, and then let that idea sink in. And then what are they doing with the second paragraph? Like, how does it start? Like, maybe this is their first point, and then under that is like specific examples that defend the first point, and like provide a lot of students with these models so that when they're writing their own paper, they can look at the model and they have something to kind of anchor them. Because if you're not doing that, and if you're not coaching them, it's going to be really difficult for them to develop this academic language proficiency.
See, that's good, just millennial strategy.
Yeah, that's a good strategy for any student, really.
Yeah.
Right?
Mhm.
Millennials want you to show them exactly what you want.
Yeah.
But you know, another thing is explicit instructions. Unless I am finding, and this semester seems to be even worse than last semester, that unless you tell them every single thing that you want, they don't get it.
Mm-hmm.
They don't get it. It's like you have to spell it out, because otherwise they'll come to you and say, but you didn't ask for this.
Yeah.
You didn't ask me to give details.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So, and that kind of goes across cultures too. It's not just
Yeah.
one of these types. However, I find that English as a second language learners, it's very important.
Yeah. Yeah. It's more, maybe
To be
more,
very explicit.
Yeah,
Yes.
very
Yes.
important. Yeah. And I don't know, because you all teach content classes, right? So I teach language and writing. So I can spend the time with students, like deconstructing a whole text, right? And having them deconstruct it. And then we talk about it as a class, like what is, like we say this word in writing education sometimes, like what are the moves the writer is making here? Like they're making moves, they're doing certain things to help us as the reader get meaning. And so what are those things and how can you do them in your text? But I don't know how much time you guys can spend on that stuff in class, because you're teaching ethics or graphic design or
radiation physics, and
Right.
it's like, no, they need to know that before they ever come in, because
yeah,
I only have so much time to teach them the content that I
right,
have.
right,
So
yeah.
they need to be able to understand what they're reading.
right, right.
So I know it,
Yeah.
it's,
I think at the very least,
Content.
maybe just put a model paper.
that's hard. Sometimes it's hard.
Could you put a model paper on Blackboard?
Yeah, that's one of the things I wrote down,
Yeah.
I've started to do that.
Yeah. Like this is exemplary. Like don't copy it, but if you can approximate this, you're going to be doing okay. And this is a terrible example. Like this is what I don't want, you know? Like
Well, it's easier in psychology because we can just skip chapters, which is what we all do.
Yeah.
Everybody does, they just pick out which one's on.
Right.
But you can't do that in radiology
Right.
or something like that. But I spent the first 4 classes developing trust before we get to any kind of material.
Yeah.
So, because then I could get anything unless we
Right.
become a learning community.
Yeah.
I'm not going to absorb a single thing, so
That's so important.
what's the point of just jumping into the material? This is such a great challenge.
And
It's
then
all my creativity, just halfway decent job of this.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
so this is just sentence frames can give students the language tools they need to demonstrate their learning of course content. So, yeah. And then Lucia, probably our most proficient English speaker, because you know how we talked about her CALP and her first language is not as much. So she might not have all the reading strategies that James has. So for her, like helping her, and this applies to writing too, but with strategies that she can use to be a better reader, to be a better writer. Graphic organizers, talk about annotating texts, talk about how people who are really good readers basically get meaning, right? Like we have all these strategies that we use. Yeah, right? What you take for granted. Here's some handouts on grammar mistakes for Lucia, and this would be good for Miguel too. This is one of those things you could never talk about in class, but just put on Blackboard. You know, like common grammar mistakes. Students can look at it if they want. So a couple things for Lucia. And then Miguel. So again, depending on when a Miguel comes here, he might lack strong literacy foundation in his first language, and he might lack BICS in his second language in English, which is really helpful for reading. So again, this is like, I'm like beating this horse to death, but he needs explicit strategies to be a better reader and to write, to be a better writer. And then other things here, paragraph frames again, provide all instructions in multiple modes, aim for clarity and simplicity. One thing that I remember from grad school, I don't remember a lot, but one thing I remember reading is this one professor said, if we don't give a student everything that they need to do an assignment well when they go to do it at like 1 in the morning, after they've forgotten everything we said to them in class, we do them a disservice. Like, we should have a super detailed assignment sheet that like anticipates all of their questions and that leaves them inexcusable about what they need to do. And so I always think about that as a teacher, because they're so helpful as a student when the actual assignment sheet like just scaffolded everything I needed to do the assignment well. And so the need for that is just amplified with English language learners. They need like
There's English.
What's that?
Because that's what I do. I'm told I should publish a book because my assignments are so detailed. I have to read.
Yeah, they have to read them. Right.
And that's the thing that just kills me.
That's
I put it down there because I know at one morning that I'm going to remember. And there's some that habitually do not read it.
Yeah.
They just ask me a million questions.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. One of my graduate professors who was like a teaching mentor to me, she told me that sometimes when she teaches undergrads too, and on the first class, she deconstructs the first assignment with the class because students don't know how to read assignments. They don't know how to read anything well. So she puts it on the doc cam, and she does this think aloud as if she's the student reading the assignment sheet. And she reads it, and she goes, okay, so the teacher wants me to do this, and okay, and she keeps reading. She says, okay, this is really important to the teacher. They really want me to defend my argument. And she did this, and it's terribly awkward to do in front of your students, but it like shows them how, because we just think they know how to read this and like get everything I want, but they obviously don't because they're turning in stuff that's just terrible. But anyways, that's just a side note. So one thing that I think is cool is if we can leverage all the students' strong suits and weaknesses and put them together so they can work together in a group in a good way, that we should try to do that. So for example, could put a Lucia and a James and a Miguel together, and they can all kind of support each other. James might have some good grammar knowledge. Lucia has good conversational skills. Miguel can contribute. We can put them in groups that kind of facilitate where they all have something to contribute, not where one student is just like James with a bunch of native speakers and he's completely left out,
Mm-hmm.
And it's more comfortable for them to speak in small groups, I think. Model what you expect students to produce. This goes back to the assignment sheets. And then create materials and assignments that incorporate students' cultures. So that's kind of all I have. Again, my goal is just kind of make you aware of these things and kind of just challenge you to try to modify things as you can depending on the students you're working with. One thing I think might be helpful to you guys is maybe to poll your students in the beginning with questions like, is English your first language or your second language? How long have you been speaking English? How long have you lived in the United States? How comfortable are you writing and reading in English? And that might help you kind of figure out where they go, and then your conversations with them and what you do to help them can be
Do you do
tailored.
that? Do you do that? you get
Yeah.
these sensitive areas around that they're not citizens. They're worried about immigration issues.
That's a good concern.
Because I gave all my students extra credit for voting,
Mm,
and a number of them got back to me and said I can't vote because I'm not a citizen.
yeah,
But a lot of them didn't
yeah,
either vote or get back to me. And I
Yeah.
wonder
yeah,
if they're worried.
yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I would stay away from maybe stay away from lived in the United States and keep it more about language.
Yeah.
That might be better. Um, but,
But my big thing is in trying to get past those emotional blocks to
yeah,
be a person who asks questions and makes comments. And,
yeah. I'm glad to hear you say all that stuff because I feel like that's a rare thing to be so concerned with the emotional state of the students. It's more, I think a lot of times professors just think more about the content, delivering the knowledge. But like you said, if they're not in a place to receive it, it's a
and I
waste.
tell them up front, you guys get really good at asking questions and critical thinking and making comments, and we get so into the discussion that we use the whole period. I guess we're gonna have to skip the test and everybody gets all the questions right. So then I just skip it, don't all skip a test because it'll be like, you guys are awesome.
Right.
Let's forget that test.
Yeah, because if they've learned it, you're satisfied.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everything right.
Or if they're learning.
We're on to the next thing. You know, I mean, sometimes that certain classes,
Yeah.
and again, it's like my class with 25 people, it's a heck of a time my class with 11 or so dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just few enough that they're starting to get comfortable with each other. And there's 3 of them that make each other laugh all the time.
Yeah.
And the rest of the class thinks it's funny. I think that really goes a long way too. Plus, like after every class, I go, you guys are so funny. This is my test. This is exactly what the professor wants.
Right.
Class like you, that's got to have some mileage too. You know?
Yeah.
So, yeah. But see, my expectations are that they all will change their mind to the psychology and all say it's the greatest class they ever had. It's the reason they come to school. And they're going to go look at the world the same again.
Mm-hmm.
And they're all going to go get PhDs. Other than that, I'm not really expecting anything. So I have a tendency to be disappointed.
Yeah.
As one might imagine.
Right.
And we actually do think of it that way. I just have to be used to being disappointed every semester. Come on, people.
Life gets in the way.
It's a whole semester. Let's turn into new human beings. That's not too much to ask.
So, in case anybody's wondering or curious for more, there's this woman named Dana Ferris. She is a scholar at University of California, Davis, I think. Is it University of California, Davis?
UC Davis.
UC
Yeah.
Davis.
Mhm.
So she's really prolific, and she's wrote 2 books. This one's called Teaching College Writing to Diverse Student Populations. This one's called Teaching ESL Composition. And these are just 2 books I had on my shelf, but she's just done a ton of work in understanding different student populations and how to better serve them. So she's got tons of stuff online, more practical stuff.
Books on tape?
I don't know if she has books on tape.
Is that one of the sources of reading?
But
Yeah, they don't have listening disabilities for that.
I'm curious, like, so yeah, like I said, this workshop is just kind of like, these are the different kinds of students. As faculty members, around this issue of like supporting English language learners, what does the college need, like, in terms of professional development?
Oh,
Like, beyond this, like, if you guys were like, this would be really helpful to me, what would that?
practice. So, well, have like 8 students, and then as a seminar, we could practice teaching them something. And we could watch how different it is for them, and then debrief with them and maybe be like, well, I'm gonna get this part,
Right.
because I don't know over my head,
Yeah.
because I'm in the child.
Right.
They wouldn't say that,
Right.
but they'd swear at me in Vietnamese.
Right.
That, I mean, that would be
Practice.
hands-on.
Yeah,
that would be
hands-on.
helpful.
Yeah.
And so the benefit to the students, I guess, would be some kind of extra credit or
Yeah.
if only we had money, they would
Yeah.
definitely do it for money.
Right.
It wouldn't take that much. Then they take $5 and get $50 or something. That would be an easy way to incentive. That would be awesome to have actual students and have something very specific you're trying to teach them.
Yeah.
And the people in this, just have like 5 people in the seminar. They're each spending a little bit of time with each student trying to get something across to them. And then there'd be a way to debrief kind of like, what happened there?
Right.
That'd be cool. I think the students, by the end, the students would love it that they were helping so much.
Right.
Helping
Yeah.
the teachers.
Mhm.
It would definitely go both ways.
What do you guys think?
It could be extra credit. It could be extra credit in their classes. Mhm.
Wouldn't that be fruitful for everyone though?
I think so.
Does
Both
it sound
sides.
feasible to you? That kind of thing?
I was also thinking, if there were like a location on campus where students who were practitioners of all different languages could maybe coach somebody, like they'll come in, my teacher said this, get what they said, can you read this? And,
Yeah.
we just help a little bit that way.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Or if
Like
there's,
a peer. sort
Like a
of thing.
mentor thing.
Yeah.
Mhm.
even if there are 5 Spanish is their first language students, and I could go over there and talk to them, like a tutor or something, and I say, okay, here's, this is what I think I'm
Yeah.
doing. What's happening at your end when I think I'm doing this?
I think the writing center at a lot of colleges kind of acts in that role. There are people who are trained to help English language learners figure out their assignments.
They're helping the students.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking about things that could help the teachers,
Yeah.
and help us
Right.
be better at it.
Better tool, help us to stock our toolboxes of
Yeah.
things that
Real
might be,
tools, yeah.
that might help.
Right. Yeah.
We break things down to a level of better understanding.
Right.
Cool.
I don't want to take too much of your time. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Appreciate
That
it.
was very, very
Yay.
educational.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, like breaking it down.
I did too.
into different people like that.
Yeah.
Personalizing it.
Yeah. Putting a face on it.
Yeah. Because we've met all 3 of those.
Yeah.
I need to be reminded that every student has their own unique, complex
I know.
issues that, yeah.
And sometimes when you're just standing up there and lecturing, you forget that.
Yeah.
And until you get a paperback or they're working on a group case study like in ethics and you realize that, well, there's been a little bit of a disconnect.
Right.
Because they won't raise their hand and ask a question.
Yeah.
No, they won't.
You have no idea that they're struggling until something presents it to you.
Yep.
I always make groups of 3 because when you get 5, if you talk on social psych, you get social working,
Mm-hmm.
where one of them, 5 or more, somebody starts saying,
Thank
well,
you.
the other one's will handle it.
Yep.
The other students will deal with it, but if you have groups of 3, it's too obvious. What are you forking over here, Kay? Eval. Where does it say was Mitchell awesome? Let me see that on here.
Give me high marks, my job depends on it. No.
That's right. Most effective by, it's awesome. It was awesome.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Yay.
Good luck.
That was very eye-opening.
That was ear opening.
Hey,
Yeah.
eye learners and ear learners.
I'm an ear learner.
So am I. I'm both. We're both, right?
I don't even know what word.
I'll see you anymore when I get home.
I've heard.
Because there was a band just right there by Rockford coming across Huntley and Woodstock, so, yeah. Are you in Rockford?